And they just excused that witness in the Yesenia Sesmas case out of Wichita. We're going to jump in with some analysis now. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile judge and an attorney. She's joining us now on the Law and Crime Network. Ashley, good to see you again.
Hey, Aaron. Nice to see you, too.
Okay, so we've got this case, and look, it's a sad case all the way around. You've got a defendant who was clearly suffering as a woman who miscarried her own child, but then she's accused of taking this drastic step and going and shooting and killing this mother who had her own small child to care for. And then passing that child off as her own. It's one of these bizarre plots that you just don't want to hear, and yet people in Kansas are listening to this and having to decide whether there's guilt or innocence here.
That's right. It's fraught with drama. And in addition to that, you've got somebody who committed a heinous crime because she didn't just shoot. She shot this individual in her head, or that's the allegation, right? She was definitely shot and killed in her head, and then this baby kidnapped. So it is absolutely a case that is emotional and is going to evoke the emotion of the jury. It's a dramatic case in terms of the facts.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and look, there's a confession of sorts here. She basically admitted to a number of acts that were part of the accusations here. And my understanding is that the prosecutors have photos of this defendant with the child she's accused of taking. What stronger evidence could they have? Why else would she have the child?
Right. And so that's my understanding as well, that they have photos not only of her taking the child, but they have evidence. We were just going to hear from one of the detectives about the cell tower pings and where the phone was. And then they locate the child there and who the child's with. So there are a lot of connections that unequivocally, in my mind, put this baby with this defendant. And so I don't know what she's going to say in terms of how she got the child or why she got the child. What they're saying is, her defense is, hey, I had permission, basically, right? Like, they agreed to give me this baby and then they didn't, but it was mine because they gave it to me. Pretty weak defense when you commit murder, but that's my understanding what part of the defense is going to be in this case.
Well, we're going to have to continue listening in. Testimony is resuming in this courtroom in Wichita, Kansas. Detective Addie Perkins just took the stand, so let's go back live to the Yesenia Sesmas case there in Wichita. You're listening to the Yesenia Sesmas, first-degree murder, kidnapping, and interference with parental custody trial out of Wichita, Kansas. It's a case where a defendant is accused of shooting a mother in the head, taking that mother's child, and then passing that mother's child off as her own child. We just heard from a police department detective who had taken DNA samples from the victim's mother, the child's grandmother, presumably to try to match up DNA to get a definitive identification on the child, which was later recovered in Dallas, Texas. The testimony before that particular witness was from another officer who said, look, they tracked the defendant's cell phone between Wichita and Dallas on the day that this whole thing happened. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile judge and an attorney. She's joining us here on Law and Crime. Ashley, look, I mean, the noose just seems to be tightening up against this particular defendant. The police went down every investigative road that we usually see in modern trials. They've looked at all the surveillance cameras. They've taken the DNA. They've done this, that, and the other thing. They have parts of a confession from the defendant. They've got a lot here.
They do. And here's where the prosecution is doing a very good job. They are laying it out so the jury understands every single step that the police took, the detectives took, the FBI took to gather the forensic evidence. And there's some really exciting forensic evidence from the prosecution standpoint. Things like, coincidentally, as you already pointed out, Aaron, there happened to be somebody that walked in front of that camera, and Perkins testified that activated the motion sensor in the camera in the stairwell. And as a result, they saw a black pickup truck that was a truck of interest. And ultimately, I think we're going to learn that truck is what in part leads law enforcement to the discovery of the baby with the defendant.
Exactly. Look, you have these coincidences that sometimes work out in cases like this. A motion-activated camera that just happens to get activated when what is presumed to be the defendant's truck drove in the parking lot down below where that camera was located. That's the kind of coincidence that police just love to find. They're in break in court right now in the Yesenia Sesmas trial out of Wichita, Kansas. We're going to take a quick break as well here on the Law and Crime Network. We'll be back with more analysis in just a moment. Testimony from an eyewitness who basically links the defendant with the apartment where the victim was found shot and killed. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile judge and an attorney. She's joining us here on the Law and Crime Network to help break this case down. Ashley, look, again, a lot of evidence here. It gets better and better for the prosecution. This neighbor just happened to see who she identified as the defendant sort of lurking in the doorway of this poor mother's apartment who was, according to the prosecution's theory, murdered because of her baby.
That's right. And here's what's interesting to me. The neighbor just testified she had never seen the defendant at that house before or noticed her before. Yet this defendant allegedly has told reporters or made statements to the effect that she was a lifelong friend of the victim mother that she allegedly shot. So there's some really good evidence here to grab onto for the prosecution.
Exactly. Look, I mean, this is the sort of stuff that prosecutors can say, hey, defendant, if the neighbors have never seen you, how could you be a close, lifelong friend? If you were a really close friend, wouldn't you be seen in the area? Wouldn't people know you? Wouldn't you be there visiting? Of course, the answer could be not necessarily, but it's an unlikely answer, and it's a hard answer to believe.
Right, and that goes directly to the credibility of the defendant, which is going to be an important piece, because as you already pointed out, Aaron, an important thing to note, that is that this, again, defendant has allegedly said that she did not intend to shoot anyone, that she took the gun with her to threaten the victim if the victim would not give the baby to her. And so her credibility is at risk if they can disprove other things that she said are true, like this was a lifelong friend. That directly affects the credibility of this particular defendant, and the jury's going to take that into account.
Yeah, I mean, why bring a weapon to threaten one's lifelong friend? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And I could see, I see the judicial look on your face, Ashley. That's the kind of look that I would fear and did fear when in front of a judge. So presumably the jurors would be reacting the same way. And for those of you listening on Sirius XM, trust me, Ashley Willcott, our guest, juvenile judge and attorney, did give that skeptical look that you didn't want to see from a teacher when you were in elementary school and you had done something wrong. That's basically what the look was. So we're going to listen to some previous testimony. There was a detective on the stand earlier today who testified about retrieving text messages in this case and trying to make sense of them. Let's go to his testimony. That was testimony in a real-life murder trial being heard by a jury right now in Wichita, Kansas against Yesenia Sesmas. She's accused of shooting a mother in the head and kidnapping that mother's young child. Of course, the mother is gone. The child will now be raised without her birth mother. That child was eventually found safe in Dallas, Texas. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile judge and an attorney. She's here with us on the Law and Crime Network to break some of this down. And look, Ashley, that testimony from Detective Eric Guzman, who was just on the witness stand in the clip we were listening to, starts to break things down. He examines these text messages between the defendant and the victim. It pinpoints what was going on, and the lack of information was also critical there.
Absolutely. So it doesn't say, I know that you've agreed to give me your baby and I'm going to come pick up Sophia, like the defendant has alleged in some of her speaking out about what's happened. It also goes to her credibility because, again, her defense that I expect, based on what she said, is this mother had agreed to give the baby Sophia to me, right? Didn't kidnap the baby, but mom agreed to give the baby to me. But then her texts are things like, and I just wrote down what the testimony was just a minute ago, I'll bring you soup or something so that you can rest. That to me doesn't feel like the same as this is someone who I've made plans to actually keep her baby for her.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if that was the case, there would be a more clear track record of that in these messages, almost certainly. So we don't have that here. I think the investigators were asking exactly the correct questions here. And Ashley, look, I said before that you were giving the look of judicial suspicion, and you're drastically more versed in ferreting out truth from fiction than I am, because I come from the journalism background, and that's how I wound up in law. And the journalism background is everybody gets their say and let the audience decide. Well, you have to decide. And you're picking the wheat from the chaff here, literally.
Right. And so I'm looking from two perspectives. Let me say this. As a judge, obviously it is a judge's role to be objective and to ensure that there's a fair process, fair procedure, and then when necessary, when it's called upon, to apply the facts to the law to the facts. That's the role of the judge. As a trial attorney, when I look at this, I pick apart all these details because honestly, again, at this point, with each little witness that we hear from, by little witness, I mean a short period of time, by each period of time that we hear from, what we're hearing are all the little pieces of evidence that add up to paint a picture of this defendant appears to have come in and taken a baby.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Exactly. Well, we're going to switch gears now and talk about another case that wrapped up today with a verdict here on the Law and Crime Network. That was the Sean Harrison case out of Boston, Massachusetts. In that case, a defendant was indeed convicted of the charges against him. He is a former school administrator who is accused of shooting a student in the head. Two cases where people were shot in the head today on Law and Crime. Not necessarily common, but that's the state of affairs in the trials that we just happen to be covering together. So let's listen to that verdict as it was delivered. That was the verdict in the Sean Harrison case, a school administrator and preacher who now has been convicted of what amounts to the Massachusetts analogy of an attempted murder charge, along with a number of other charges related to drugs, ammunition, and weapons. It was an interesting defense strategy, Ashley, that the defense basically said, okay, look, convict him of 3 of the charges because he had been given a weapon or a couple of weapons and some ammunition from a relative's estate, and he didn't have the proper permits for them, and that's the only thing he was guilty of doing, but you can convict him of those things. They tried to take that tactic, hoping that that would be enough, and it wasn't enough at all. This was a clean conviction across the board.
It sure was. And, you know, I listened to the victim's testimony, and this victim clearly ID'd the defendant as the one who shot him. And so I'm not too surprised, in spite of the defense's argument, that he's been convicted basically on all counts that he was charged with, including intent to kill the student that he shot.
Yes, that's exactly how the jury took it. I had some questions. Apparently, the jury was certainly satisfied in its verdict, making that decision to convict the defendant across the board. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're expecting more live testimony in the Yesenia Sesmas murder case out of Wichita, Kansas. Okay, folks, sorry about that. It looks like we were waiting for another witness to take the stand. We're hearing that another witness, one more witness in particular, is supposed to be taking the stand. We are hearing that that may be a witness who talks about DNA. Now, Ashley Willcott is still on the line with us. She's a juvenile judge and an attorney. And Ashley, we heard about DNA collection just within the last hour or so here this afternoon. So it's possible we could be expecting the results now. That would seem to be a logical flow for this case.
Absolutely. And so listeners, I know, are very in tune with trials and what happens. But for those of you that might be just tuning in, part of what happens is the chain of custody. And I know you know this, Aaron. They have to prove chain of custody, who did every step, what happened next, so that they can prove they collected the evidence. I would agree with you. This is going to lead towards who did the DNA identify.
That's what it sounds like. And of course, you know, look, sometimes we jump the gun a little bit. We hear things are picking up, and it takes a couple seconds for everybody to sit down. And that's exactly what just happened in the Yesenia Sesmas case, Wichita, Kansas. Just a horrific situation here. Laura Abarca, the mother, shot and killed. The defendant has this sort of bizarre story that she was just trying to scare that victim with the gun, not necessarily shoot and kill her. But ultimately, her body was found slumped over in her home. The daughter, Sophia Abarca, was missing, and police later caught up with that child all the way down in Dallas. They tracked the defendant's cell phone. There were text messages from that cell phone recovered. You've got the surveillance camera indicating that the defendant's truck was in the area. This trial is basically shaping up to hit all of the bases of modern trial evidence with surveillance cameras, cell phones, text messages, you name it here.
Absolutely. And you really have to commend law enforcement because most importantly, in spite of the reasons that this happened or the defendant did or didn't do it based on what the jury decides in the end, law enforcement took this and ran and followed every possible lead. And as a result, you have a baby that's safe. Thank goodness.
Yes, true. And in many of the cases that we sit here and try, we wish we had more answers because there was a test that wasn't done or there was a test that wasn't ordered. And when we wind up in convictions in those cases, there's still that little nagging thought in the back of my head, at least, and perhaps I'm being overly skeptical, not trying the case beyond a reasonable doubt, but trying to the exclusion of any doubt whatsoever in my own head. But I'm not on the jury. I get to do that. Look, there's always that little nagging suspicion that, could that test have yielded either more evidence to make us more certain or less evidence or evidence of someone else? Here, it looks like they hit all the bases.
I think so, too. And you never, ever, ever, the worst case scenario, want to have someone wrongly convicted. So by hitting all those bases, I completely agree with you. It lays out, hopefully answers every question by the end of the trial. We'll see. Yes,
we have another witness on the stand now. This is the Yesenia Sesmas case out of Wichita, Kansas. This is a forensic scientist, I'm being told. Let's listen to that testimony now. Testimony there from Sarah Gearing. She's a DNA expert who went over her qualifications and is explaining how they do DNA tests. We've heard this in every trial. Ashley Willcott is a juvenile judge and an attorney. She's with us here on the Law and Crime Network as we continue to talk about the Yesenia Sesmas case out of Wichita, Kansas. The case of a defendant who's facing first-degree murder charges, kidnapping charges, and interference with parental custody charges related to the death of a mother and the kidnapping of that mother's child. So, Ashley, look, you've got to get this on the record. You've got to get the professional qualifications of the DNA expert on the record so that an appeals court can look at it and so that jurors trust the witness on the stand. But what we really want to hear are the results. Is there DNA that's relevant to this case? Who did it come from and who does it match? Of course, correct?
Exactly. And the important part of this testimony that, yes, it's a little tedious to have to go through as an attorney and also listen to as a jury member, but it's really important because this can prove or not that this was not cross-contaminated. This DNA sample is accurate and correct. So once they tell us whose DNA it is, we can trust it's a reliable result.
Yeah, and oftentimes this is given in some degree of probability. The expert doesn't get up there and say, oh, yes, it is exactly this person's DNA. What they do is they say there's a certain probability that it is, and oftentimes a match is what, up in the, 1 in a million, 1 in a billion chance, and that's beyond the number of people on the planet, and statistically it's because DNA is more complicated than apparently the number of people who are living on the planet at this given moment. But look, that's important, and it takes a long time to get through. But ultimately, in there is the nugget of truth that everyone is looking for.
Absolutely, and that is exactly what you've already identified. Whose DNA is this, and who is that connected to? Because, again, this is a step-by-step process the prosecution is going through to try to prove that, in fact, this was not her baby, that she kidnapped this baby, that Sophia belongs to the mother who's been shot in the head.
I heard a prosecutor say years ago, this is going back maybe 10 or 15 years when I was a local reporter for local television stations, that oftentimes prosecutors have to get DNA evidence because if jurors are presented a case, even if it's a Loctite case with eyewitnesses and video of the defendant shooting and killing someone, which is not this case, I'm just saying hypothetically, that if there's not DNA, a lot of times juries think, well, why isn't there DNA? And they start to wonder about that. So it's almost a requirement, quote unquote, for prosecutors to get this evidence and present it. It puts a higher burden on prosecutors, but juries seem to demand it.
I agree with you, and I think part of that is because before DNA testing, you and I both know and have covered trials where old convictions, when DNA testing did not exist to the extent that it does now, didn't happen. Now that they do it, it either does one of two things. It either kind of confirms the conviction, or in the alternative, sometimes it shows, you know what, it wasn't actually this defendant that was convicted. So DNA evidence is a very important piece of all trials now. I agree with you, especially when you have heinous charges like these.
Even if you had 1 million people on the witness stand saying this defendant shot this person, one juror back there is going to say, well, why didn't they test the handle of the gun for the defendant's DNA? So that's why these tests are done in so many of these cases. And it's not necessarily the reason here, but it's why we see so much of this evidence. Overall, though, a horrific case here out of Wichita, Kansas. You've got a young mother, Laura Abarca, who was shot in the head. That doesn't just sound like an accidental shot, but that's what the defendant is claiming. Shot in the head. And then that mother's child, Sophia Abarca, was taken from Wichita, Kansas, all the way down to Dallas, Texas, where investigators caught up with her a couple of days later. Thank goodness they found this child and were able to take custody of the child, bring the child back to a position of being cared for. But that child is going to grow up without her mother.
It's a really unfortunate case. And Aaron, what's interesting is this defendant has said publicly, my plan was to move to Mexico with the baby and my boyfriend. And so ostensibly, this could have been in something in 20, 30 years. It was a cold case being pulled back out to say, whatever happened to Sophia, baby Sophia, where is she? Where did she grow up? Did somebody kill her? So in that sense, there's a positive outcome. But you're right, heinous crime, whether it was an accident or not, it doesn't matter. The mother's still dead in terms of, you know, the emotional aspect of this case.
Very, very sad. Well, we have a DNA expert on the stand. We're going to dip back into testimony and see if things are picking up in the Yesenia Sesmas murder case out of Wichita. This is the Yesenia Sesmas case out of Wichita, Kansas, here on the Law and Crime Network. You just listened to testimony from a DNA expert who said, okay, Yesenia Sesmas, the defendant, is not the mother of the child she's accused of taking. That seemed to be a foregone conclusion, but they did the DNA test just to confirm. The rest of the information that we heard from that expert wasn't a bombshell. The father of the child's DNA was on the door. Not a surprise because, as the prosecutor mentioned, he could have been coming home from work and deposited his DNA on the door. He can deposit his DNA on a house where he is frequently coming and going. That's nothing nefarious. Ashley Willcott is with us. She's a juvenile attorney, a juvenile judge rather, and an attorney. And Ashley, we're hearing that court's wrapping up for the day. We were expecting that to be the last witness, and indeed, apparently, that is what it is. But I didn't hear a bombshell in this DNA testimony. Did you?
No, other than it confirms what you just pointed out the jury wants to know, and that is this defendant is absolutely DNA-wise not the mother of Sophia. Two other points. One is it did rule that there's a 99.9% probability that the alleged father is in fact the biological father. But if I were the defense, I would also argue, listen, there were swabs from a couple of doorknobs, and the testimony has said, hey, father's DNA, he touched the doorknobs. But notice the absence of any testimony that the defendant's DNA is on any doorknobs. I would look at that if I were the defense.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing. Now, I want to make sure I heard you properly. I heard that they said that Manuel Gonzalez was the father of Sophia. Yes, and they worded it as a double negative, that they couldn't exclude him. In other words, they could include him.
Right.
So that's one of those, look, we all love our double negatives, but we've got to listen to them carefully. This has really been provided, as I take it, to drive at that kidnapping charge. They need to prove that this defendant, Yesenia Sesmas, took Sophia Abarca, who was not her daughter. And the DNA proves that Sophia Abarca is not the daughter of the defendant.
Absolutely. And I think this also goes, as you know, the defendant has said, oh, I didn't tell anyone about my miscarriage at 5 months, and this was my baby. And she sent pictures to the boyfriend and said, this is my baby. So this evidence proves that was not true, regardless of what she said.
refuting the defendant's words. That's the game of prosecutors, and I think they played that rather skillfully today. So we're going to wrap up for the day. Ashley Willcott, a juvenile judge and attorney, thanks a lot for joining us. Your insight is always excellent.
Thank you. I appreciate you, Aaron.
Okay, a reminder for everyone that we're going to be back in the Yesenia Sesmas case tomorrow here on Law&Crime, and we're also monitoring another case out of the Carolinas. This is a case where we're expecting opening statements tomorrow, and the accusations are that a prosecutor in one county conspired with a prosecutor in another county to hire one another's wives, and that one of the wives was hired for a no-show job that was paying her a salary while she was really going to school. So these prosecutors have found themselves on the other side of the law. One of the prosecutors entered some kind of a plea and is expected to testify against the other prosecutor. Really interesting case. Jury selection is almost complete in that case. They have to pick a couple more jurors. They are expecting to do that tomorrow, and then we are expecting to hear opening statements. I'll be with you in the midday hours here on the Law&Crime Network tomorrow. Of course, a reminder that we're on the air at least from 9 a.m. until at least 5 p.m. Monday through Friday with live coverage of trials and hearings. For now, this is Aaron Keller, and for everybody here at Law&Crime, have a good evening.